As part of its Open and Innovative Education Week, the Open University of Hong Kong invited Professor John Traxler, Professor of Mobile Learning at the University of Wolverhampton in the United Kingdom, to present a seminar on success factors in mobile learning research. Professor Traxler highlighted some of the achievements made by the mobile learning research community over the past few years, and gave examples of successful applications of mobile technology in education.
I was asked to talk about success factors, and actually conscious that I found it quite problematic. I mean, partly because it's very easy to talk about success, and it's very, very easy to get published if you talk about success, but not many people have got careers that have been based on failure. And not many people get published on the basis of failure, but I suspect there's an awful lot of failure that goes on that we could be learning from. And I think possibly what gets presented sometimes as success might be only a partial success, or to put it another way, might be a partial failure as well. I think the mobile learning research community has probably achieved 2 or 3 or 4 things. We've clearly used the technology to extend the reach of learning in the sense that we can take it to people, communities, countries, regions, where educational opportunities were previously a lot more problematic. They were too expensive, too far away, or too dangerous. That's not an exhaustive list, but we've reached into places where we couldn't before, to people who we couldn't before. And I'll show you some examples. And the second would be that we've made learning, in some sense, richer. And that might mean in a kind of multimedia sense, but actually in the sense that we've made it maybe more personalised or more contextual or more situated. All of those kind of things that educational technology has aspired to. Thirdly, I think we've challenged or extended some of the accepted theories about learning with educational technology. That's okay, we're friends here and we're academics, so I can say we've made a theoretical contribution. And the fourth achievement, success, actually, is the rather fluffy one that students like it. And that's rather difficult to measure, but everyone says it, so they're probably right. And the extension to that, it's actually the potential students or the actual students who are disenfranchised or disengaged. Actually, they're the ones that are most likely to become engaged or become enfranchised as learners. I mean, there's a kind of anecdote that portrays that slightly problematic, that I was one of the evaluators for M-Learning, which was one of the 2 big flagship mobile learning projects in 2001. And we did an evaluation of all of the learners, and the EU funded this to the tune of, I don't know, 5.8 million euros maybe. And with a perfectly kind of instrumental agenda. These people are out there without jobs and they're homeless. So we need to attract them into learning so that we can get them into universities so they'll get jobs and pay taxes. Simple as that. And so there was a perception that mobile learning was going to be expensive, and at the time that was true. But that was okay because that was the kind of bait that got them into college, which would be much cheaper. And like I say, that would put them on the ladder to being taxpayers, and that was basically what we needed. But actually, when we did the evaluation, half the students said, oh yeah, I feel much more confident as a learner, I want to go to college. And the others said, I really like learning this way, why should I go to college? There is a myth that mobile learning engages and enthuses learners. So those are the 3.5 achievements, successes. But maybe I can give a bit more kind of detail and examples. So going back to the first one was actually our capacity, ability, achievements in extending the reach of some kind of learning, which, I mean, if you like, you could portray it as distance learning. And that's the easiest way of understanding it, because we're talking about using the technology to triumph over distance, where you've got learners, but actually spread across distances as well as being a long way away, then clearly the capacity of mobile phone networks is the obvious bridge across those kinds of distances. So this is an example of a project called Dr. Math, run at the Maraka Institute, which is part of CSIR in South Africa. And they've done a lot of work in exploiting different kinds of technology, but mobile a lot of the time. And it's a really simple system that allows kids out of school in South Africa, where the maths matriculation results are awful, to get connected via their mobile phones and a messaging system through a technology called Mixit, but I mean basically it's messaging of some sort, to maths undergraduates. And pedagogically this is not rocket science, but then you can almost argue a lot of the time the revolutionary innovation is quite problematic because either people don't like it or it unsettles them, or it's not what they're used to. Well, this is exactly what they're used to, which is kind of asking a teacher questions about maths. It's not technically very clever and it's not pedagogically very clever, but they've actually cracked the problem about sustainability because the stakeholders, if you like, are the kids, and they use Mixit all the time and they don't even notice the cost, and the cost is fractional. And then clearly that Mixit, who are a company that sit above the network, are making money out of the kids, but there's so many kids that it's quite a lot of money, even though the kids think it's practically free. The maths undergraduates are getting credit for community service. So there's always a supply of undergraduates who are essentially being paid. It goes towards their degree. They're getting support. Phone company is collecting the money, the revenue. And it's reaching across townships, and it's been going 5 or 6 years. This was an example taken from London, and it's a facility called SatLav, and hopefully it's self-explanatory. It says if you want to know where the nearest public lavatories are, then you just text the word toilet to this number. And there's a lot of really clever work in mobile learning using sophisticated technology that exploits context and location. And this is something else friends of mine in Aberdeen University have done with SMS. It's a kind of real-time simulation of an environmental disaster. And all of the students are each individually playing the role of some kind of emergency personnel. And the situation is that the water in a reservoir is rising and that rainfall is expected. What are they going to do? Are they going to evacuate, or are they going to hedge their bets and wait a bit? And they text the answer. And each one will presumably make a different answer or a different decision based on what they've learnt. But they'll then get a message in real time saying, for example, it's 3 hours later, you decided not to evacuate, the dam is now 1 inch short of overflowing, what do you want to do? So they might be following a completely different scenario, making completely different decisions to any of their fellow students. And they're learning something about this disaster management scenario. And it's all happening by SMS. But it's really only basically what we in computer science you call a decision tree. If they make this decision, this is how you respond. If they make this decision, and it just is a branching tree. Well, you can use that structure not just for this particular scenario, but for any number of other scenarios. Okay, but having made the point that I think we've used the technology to reach across distances, some of those distances have been not geometric or geographical, but social or economic. And this is a half an example in the sense that it's traveller communities, circus people, where they have two problems in terms of educating their children. One is the obvious one that they move around, and the other is that they are socially stigmatised. So you could imagine putting them into different schools each different week, but that would only solve the problem about mobility, that wouldn't solve the problem about stigma. The scenario was that you'd develop appropriate mobile learning that allowed them to keep in touch with their base school. And I think the, what would you call it, the transhumance of circus folk is they are static for the winter months, So the kids can go to one school and then they move around from site to site, maybe on a weekly or a fortnightly basis after that. You can then use the mobile technology to keep them in touch with their human face-to-face teacher, and maybe to keep the group together as well. They may go different places, but they're all in touch with their classmates. And that is addressing, or makes them more robust in the face of adverse social reactions from normal sedentary kids in other schools. I mean, they can go into the other schools, but they've got a fallback. So that's kind of reaching across a different kind of distance. That's reaching across a social distance. And there's also a lot of kind of obvious rhetoric around the fact that mobile learning allows people to exploit dead time. So bus stations, this is Nairobi bus station as it happens. When you're in the elevator or in the bus or in the, when you've actually got nothing else to do and you've got 45 seconds to spare. There's also research published in one of the English newspapers saying that 75% of the British population use their mobile phone on the toilet. So that's another kind of learning space that we need to populate. This is actually part of a different kind of conversation about the fact that technology allows social and economic pressures to invade our private time, if you like, and also to kind of monetize it. Suddenly dead time becomes an economic asset because we can use it for an economic activity or a learning activity, which may be very similar. If you look at it fairly superficially, yeah, we've got lots of time when we're not actually doing anything, or we might be relaxing, or we might be resting, but we can reach into those times and spaces to give people the opportunity to learn. This is an example of a project in Mexico where, a lot of the time with these attempted large-scale projects into remote or rural areas, the only way they become sustainable is if you can exploit the fact that people already own the technology and you don't need to buy it for them. And in this case, this was exploiting the fact that the parents of these kids own camera phones, so the only cost was actually distributing a little tripod. And again, it's not a revolutionary pedagogy, it's that business of maths teachers wanting to see your workings. So actually the kids just do their maths homework, it gets up with the camera on, it gets uploaded to a server, the teacher can look at all of them, can look at common mistakes, can give a model answer and send it back. And so again, it's buying into a very conventional pedagogy, but it's actually helping kids who may not get much help any other way. And this is now I'm sorry, I don't know if you want to call e-book readers mobile. They strike me as fairly mobile. And certainly the learners and the learning is mobile, but there are big pushes from various foundations and charities such as World Reader, I think it's called, to distribute basically the entire school library on an e-book reader. And you could say certainly that it's a very specific model of education that consists of content, not discussion, just content. And I think they've been distributing crate loads of these in Kenya or Gambia or Ghana, for example. Again, at first sight, it seems wildly attractive. Suddenly these kids have access to the riches of the world's libraries. Hundreds, if not probably hundreds of thousands of books are now available to this girl. And I think that's okay. I think it's also slightly problematic in the sense that, well, actually, she seems to be reading a book by Virginia Woolf, who is a white European woman writing in English. So there is a risk that because you can mass produce this stuff, well, that the mass production of this stuff in English is far cheaper than producing it in Luo or Kikuyu or Swahili or any of Africa's other 400 languages. So it's not neutral in the cultural sense. it massively tips the balance in favour of English and maybe Swahili, but away from mother tongues, and it tips the balance in favour of a particular style of learning, which is to do with reading, memorisation, assimilation, content and transmission, unless the teachers can intervene and engender some discussion, some conversation and some different kind of educational models. Again, if we're looking at successes, they are, as it were, partial. Another way in which mobile learning can reach out to communities is not across economic or social distance or across geographical or geometric distance, but into communities of people with cognitive or physiological problems or difficulties. So this is someone who's blind, for whom many educational opportunities were problematic or difficult, and they used to have expensive, dedicated digital equipment to help them as undergraduates, for example. But now they can all have a mobile phone. You just need the appropriate apps. And so it allows learning to reach into communities, not across, across, if you like, physiological distances, because they're different from the majority of us, but we can still make them part of the learning community. And my second point was that I think that we've also been relatively successful in showing how learning can be, in some sense, richer. One of the subcategories of that is what I've called contingent learning. It's my phrase, so, which is ways in which the technology can help us move away from learning experiences that are scripted and hardwired to ones that are maybe more interactive or more contingent. They are dependent on the here and now, not on any kind of script. And an example I used yesterday when I was talking was actually field trips, of how you can move away from a notion that you go into the field as a student geographer or a student ecologist. You can move away from a situation where you go into the field, you take your readings, you do your measurements, and then you have to go and do the working out later, to actually, you can not only process the measurements in situ, in the field, but you can move a step on from that. So, for example, Mike Sharples and Eileen Scanlon at the Open University have explored how you can use the technology not to train scientists to reproduce the science of 200 years ago, but how you can train and encourage scientific attitudes where they can form a hypothesis in the environment about, I don't know, thermal pollution or traffic behaviour or aspects of natural history. How you can form a hypothesis, take the measurements, see if the hypothesis works, and then challenge it or refine it by doing the calculations and making more measurements. And you could argue that, I don't know, traffic pollution in a UK city is not of universal interest, but actually the process of scientific inquiry, where you say, I've got a theory, or rather I've got a hypothesis, how can I test it, how can I make it better, how can I make it more robust, what measurements do I need to do? That's the important thing, and it's also more meaningful. You can sit in a classroom and think about bird migration for an awfully long time and learn nothing at all, or you can go out and explore it and do measurements, take numbers, and suddenly learn a lot more that is meaningful. And a lot of, I think, what's happened with mobile learning has been about moving away from the classroom, the lecture theatre, the institution, and somehow going out into the real world. And so that's, if you like, contingent learning. Oh, sorry, this example is actually those things that people use in lectures, personal response systems. Rather than kind of conducting the lecture where I read it out and you listen, I can actually find out how it's going. You know, even for large lectures, especially maybe for large lectures, I can ask a question and 20 people can get it right and 380 can get it wrong. So I now think, right, I need to do something differently, plan B. Or actually 380 get it right, okay, so I can go a bit faster. It depends, and Tomorrow, with a different group of students, the reactions are going to be completely different and I'll have to respond differently, but it's contingent. And I guess this is another one of the obvious successes that is around any kind of education where there is a vocational placement, where people are trained to be vets or nurses or doctors or teachers, and they spend some time in a professional setting, in the classroom, in the hospital, where suddenly they can take their devices with them and stay connected to their tutor, stay connected to their colleagues. They can, I don't know, write down reflections, work on essays, take pictures, make recordings, take reference material with them. And I think there's a lot of opportunity, and there's been some success with language. I mean, certainly 15 or 20 years ago, we were looking at using SMS for learning vocabulary. And that's a kind of fairly low-level task, and it's about repetition. So I think it's Mike Levy, in the book that Agnes and I wrote, in Australia, was doing Italian vocabulary. And you just kind of randomise the vocabulary list, and you broadcast it on SMS 3 times a day with a random set of words, and it soaks up. I think where there are big opportunities, again, is for using context. So rather than, if you like, random words or words that have no meaning to me or my situation, maybe we could look at the technology, again, using context, because GPS will tell us where we are, and actually I can find out the Italian for whiteboard, the Italian for monitor, the Italian for podium, the Italian for stage, would have a lot more meaning to me. So there's a lot of work around language and language acquisition, using social media, using apps, using the cloud and so on. But I think there's still quite a lot of possibilities out there. And this is one example of contextual learning, if you like. This was a project in the south of England where they got kids on their walk to and from school, from their homes, to track, I think it was air pollution. They record them on their a sensor stuck onto their mobile phone. It would use GPS to record the location. And it's a small but interesting example of a kind of citizen science. The interesting thing for me actually was the fact that the school was so proud of this project that tracked quite a lot of pollution in quite a large geographical area around the school. They were so proud of it, they put it on the web and then quickly realised they'd just told the whole of the world where all of their kids lived. So there were considerable problems. There are considerable problems around the ethics of mobile learning activity, and I've examined PhDs and run into this, that suddenly I'm finding out where people are in the middle of the night and who they're with, just because someone is interested in contextual learning and hadn't thought through the ethical implications. But this is a far more straightforward example of contextual learning. This again is Mike Sharples from a long time ago, in the Uffizi gallery, looking at the Botticelli's Annunciation. Someone is standing there with an early, in fact PDA, not a mobile phone, but with an early PDA, and the phone knows where you are. It knows that's what you're standing in front of, and it can then give you information about Botticelli, about the painting. If you stand there for a long time, it will give you more information. Say, are you really, really interested? Maybe you'd like to see a video. And I mean, maybe understandably, this was an area of massive research activity, relatively speaking, was how do you make learning contextual? How do you make it relevant to the time and the place of the learner? And clearly a personal device is one way of facilitating that. And so we've seen these kinds of experiments and projects in botanical gardens and castles and zoos and art galleries, all sorts of cultural spaces, all sorts of environmental spaces, indoor, outdoor, formal, informal. We've seen it in courses, we've seen it with kind of casual visitors, and maybe this is an example of what I was talking about earlier, that if you looked at it in very kind of tight and specific terms about a pedagogic and technological achievement, it's actually quite straightforward. People like it, they love it, they learn. But if you then look at it in kind of organisational and institutional terms, it's problematic because most of these early experiments involved giving the learners the device, or lending it to them. So it's not actually financially sustainable, not unless you can give everyone a device. And it's not sustainable either, possibly in the sense that it involves an enormous amount of editorial work, or educational work, if you like. Finding the material, putting it together, sequencing it and testing it. And I hope that we'll kind of move on from that to a more successful scenario where, well, we think about firstly using the learner's own devices, and so there isn't a kind of ongoing financial commitment to providing these things. And also we think about maybe a more Web 2.0 experience where rather than depending on a kind of Web 1.0 mentality that the clever people in the museum are going to tell the visitors everything they need to know, that actually we can capture people's reactions, recollections, maybe their own images, so that progressively you get a kind of richer and richer experience because you've got a kind of seed material provided by the museum curators, but you've then got an accretion of how people have reacted, what they've learned, what they'd like to add, so that every visitor gets a kind of successively richer experience and becomes an active learner rather than a kind of consumer of stuff that was put there when the system was set up. And also it means that you've got a living system, hopefully more capable of responding to changes in the environment. It's not just frozen at the time it was created. And if you could then build systems that exploited the learner's own devices, what they could learn from the learners would be massively increased. I mean, at the moment, systems like this would know that you seem to like the Botticellis, and it can make suggestions about looking at other Botticellis in the museum, but it's only learnt that for that particular episode while you were there, and then you give the device back and it gets wiped and that's it, and the next person starts from scratch. So it obviously has the opportunity to make inferences, but they're not very big ones because all that is learnt about your preferences has just been in that episode when you came into the museum until you left. Now, if you could actually use the learner's own devices, you could have a far richer history because in my ideal scenario, you'd go from one museum to another museum. You might go back to the original one, and the system would be able to learn a lot more about your preferences. Oh, actually, this is the second time you've been to Botticelli's Annunciation. We won't show you the stuff we showed you before. We'll show you something else. Or actually, other people have commented on Botticelli's Annunciation. Would you like to see what they've said, or skip something else and look at some Michelangelo's? You can build up a far greater sense of the learner's preferences, behaviour, attitudes, and have something that's sustainable as well. And then after that, what we've got, if you like, as another part of this general achievement about enriching learning is virtual reality or augmented reality, where you're using the mobile phone as a camera viewfinder, as a camera phone viewfinder, and you're looking at the world through it, but it knows where it is. It's GPS enabled, so in fact the curb, the pavement, the road, the building are really there, but the car isn't. The technology inserts that image, and it's a completely kind of authentic image. You can walk up to it, you can walk round it. And in a sense, the educational possibilities are endless, and so are the commercial ones, actually. And so you can not only do it for individual learners, but you can turn it into a kind of social learning. This is Dam Square in Amsterdam, where many people can be participating in the shared experience of an event. And this is a different example of making it a more social phenomenon, if you like, where people can share and interact with a collective experience. And I think there are also potentially successes in looking at how mobile technology can be used in the flipped classroom. Because The kind of base, as I understand it, the basic rhetoric around the flipped classroom is to ask, why are students with me as the teacher face to face? What is it they are uniquely getting from me face to face? What is it they are uniquely getting from being with each other face to face? And what is it they've come onto campus for they couldn't get any other way? And then the next question that follows on from that is, okay, how can we use technology to optimize their face-to-face experience and to enable them to do stuff online, offline, distantly, remotely, asynchronously, or whatever, that means they're going to get the maximum value out of being with each other and being face-to-face. That's an argument for a conventional campus university. For a distance university, the argument is presumably slightly differently, although most distance universities, I guess, have tutorials, so it's still just the same kind of argument with a different balance of resources and emphasis and pedagogy and so on. But mobile technology clearly has a place in the flipped classroom because it allows students to do many of the things they would have come on campus to do, like consume a lecture, but to do it on the bus. And I guess for any institution, it's a case of kind of working through what are the specific answers to those questions for their institution, and what role does mobile learning and mobile technology have to play. Moving on from, if you like, the classic picture of mobile learning, the one that's kind of propagated by the mobile learning research community, to something rather different. How are people using mobiles for learning? What we see is a far more kind of interesting and challenging picture, I suppose, where there are clearly the opportunities for big successes, but we're struggling to get our head around them. And that's to do with the abundance of content and communities out there that people are learning from. So these are just 2 podcasts from iTunes. You know, and if you want to learn a language, why would I go to a course? Why would I enroll at a university? There is just a blizzard of stuff being produced for me to learn from, either for free or for very little expense. And podcasts are part of it. There are 7 or 8 series of podcasts for learning Arabic. There's at least 2 for learning Ottoman history. But there are also a blizzard of apps for learning stuff, for learning from. And there are various ways in which people can not only learn, but can help other people learn. There are various forms of social media where you see a kind of ecosystem developing of communities and content converging. And if I look at some of the podcasts I'm interested in, you know, in I don't know, the history of Anglo-Saxon England, you start off seeing that there is a podcast for you to consume, but very quickly around that you get a community of people forming a Facebook group or a Twitter feed where they're discussing what they're learning, where they're contributing what they're learning. And in many cases you see people, I mean, I'm just particularly interested in history, where you see people that have become interested in the history of Rome because they've learnt from a podcast decide to start a history of China. There is a community of people learning, and a growing community of people learning, developing resources. YouTube is another example. There is an enormous volume of stuff that is being generated in what you could call a kind of democratic, bottom-up fashion that is in an uneasy relationship with universities, colleges and schools and institutions of formalised learning. But also what you see is many examples of what we call citizen journalism, if you like, where people, and this is the London bombings of 7th of July, quite a long time ago now, but where you see members of the public take video on camera phones of a bombing, and within minutes it's uploaded into YouTube and available across the world. And I mean, there are quite a few observations you can make around this. It's portrayed as a more democratic production of news. And you could argue that means it's a more democratic production of knowledge from which people can learn. I mean, it isn't actually democratic because it's not controlled by the BBC or the Ministry of Information or News International, but it's still controlled in some way or another by Google or iTunes or a large corporation rather than a government body. So it's not necessarily more democratic, but it's certainly very different and more fluid. But it also suggests that the way knowledge is produced is a lot more kind of partial and transient than, for example, the BBC would produce news where there is only one version. It's very easy to pull for one lot of captions for this to be something about terrorist outrage, brave Londoners, but it's equally possible to see subtitles about this is a liberation movement fighting oppression. There are lots of different spins you can put on this that might otherwise have been suppressed. And it's our students that go into the world more and more where this is the nature of the knowledge that they're going to learn from. That is, contested or problematic or transient. And that is certainly an argument for what in the UK or in Europe is called digital literacy. We will live in a world increasingly populated by digital media, digital formats, digital knowledge, digital communities. And if our students are to flourish or create or survive, they can't just naively consume everything that's out there. And they can't naively create stuff either. I mean, one aspect of this is around the kind of employability agenda, which says, where we say to our students, you really can't take all of your clothes off in the middle of Cardiff and post a photo of it on Facebook, because probably the first thing your potential employer is going to do is ask you for permission to look at Facebook. And so I guess increasingly universities in the UK are looking at a kind of lifelong learning agenda of saying, well, I guess the first thing that our undergraduates do when they graduate is stop using Moodle. And what they carry on using for the rest of their lives is probably Facebook or YouTube or iTunes. So actually, how do you kind of understand that educational resource? You know, those communities, I don't know, bird spotting in Facebook. How do you learn? How do you become an active learner in those communities if that's what you want to learn? So I guess there's a move away from the way we had previously conceptualised education to something rather different. And building on that, several people, friends and colleagues of mine, heard about MOOCs, I can't remember now, 6 or 7 years ago, and decided that one way of encouraging more people to become involved and interested in mobile learning was actually to create a MOOC. And this was a very early version where I think the original pedagogy behind MOOCs was to do with a massive number of learners actively contributing and learning from each other. And there being what would you call it, kind of crowdsourced learning. And so we decided to facilitate a MOOC, and we didn't advertise it. We got about 600 people involved. And what we did was use free and open source software. So we used Google Docs, WordPress, Facebook, Twitter, iTunes, YouTube, I can't remember, but a whole bunch of stuff, but just basically provided a framework saying that here is the entry portal and here is just a bit of kind of stimulus, but actually we want to hear from everyone and we want to see a debate and we want to see you contributing and we want to see your videos and we want to hear your reactions. And it was brilliant. And it went on for about, we did it twice, went on for about 4 weeks, I think, or 3 weeks. Yes, and I'm not sure as a kind of archived resource whether it's actually of any value, but as an activity for something for learners to participate in that was very kind of ideologically purist in the sense of building on the connectivist pedagogy. it was an interesting experience in putting together all of this stuff that I'm talking about, that enabled people to learn actively, to contribute, to argue, to discuss, to transform. That, I guess, seems a long way away from where MOOCs have ended up. But as I say, there's a kind of downside that all of a sudden the world is full of content and people learning from each other and forming communities. They could form all sorts of communities. Some of them just bizarre and some of them probably quite bad. And you know, this is moving on from the idea of mobile learning to actually saying, what does education need to address? And maybe it's the challenge of lifelong learning in a very confused, complex world of a lot of things happening, a lot of things being available, but actually a lot of it, most of it, for most of the world, being accessed on mobile phones. So I'm kind of arguing from a shift from those kinds of managed experiences coming from educational institutions, education professionals delivering the educational curriculum, and saying that mobile technology had a role to play in that, to say actually it's playing a role whether we like it or not, and it's playing a role in the outside world, and it's playing a role in real life, and it's the way in which people are creating images, ideas, conversations, information, creating all of those things and sharing them, transforming them, discussing them, passing them on, storing them, taking ownership of them. And I think actually that's a more interesting opportunity where we are still waiting for the successes than maybe what we've done previously, looking relatively inward in our institutions and maybe looking relatively backward, because I think a lot of what we did in the early days of mobile learning was see it as the dream come true of the e-learning community, where e-learning seemed to be promising us learning anytime, anywhere, and we could actually give them learning just for you and just in time. But it built on the aspirations or the legacy of e-learning researchers. And so where we might have developed theories of mobile learning, they were probably theories of e-learning that we'd adapted. And so I'm kind of arguing for looking for our successes in future in a different direction, not the way we used to do things, but for more people in better ways, but actually totally different ways, working with people we haven't met, doing things we haven't thought about yet. And so maybe I'll to finish there and ask if anyone's got any questions.